Jessica's concept is based on a scholarly work that was done by another one of our students, Helen from Canyon. I don't know, Helen, I don't think she's here. She must be in the costume shop now. But Helen's thesis is based on, it's a study of Macbeth, and it's based on trauma theory. And what she's done is to reconstruct what might have been a traumatic experience suffered by Macbeth and his wife. And that experience might have been a botched C-section, wherein the baby didn't survive and the mother did. And there are all kinds of, I'm not going to take up time here to explain how persuasive this is, except to say that Helen's article has just been published by a journal that comes out of the Utah Shakespeare Festival. It's a compelling study, and it's going to be part of her thesis for her master's degree in the English department. Helen's presentation is equally extraordinary because it takes up the challenge of how in the world you would convey this on the stage.
Make him say, Jessica.
Also, in April you can hear a more full presentation of this because you'll be giving, along with Helen, a presentation of this, a more full presentation of this for the English department lecture series. And I'll post that on the events calendar.
So, as Dr. DiBiase said, my name is Jessica Holmes. I'm actually a double major, and I'll be graduating in May with my undergraduate degree both in English and performance drama. And this was initially an honors program, honors by contract assignment that we had discussed this semester before, and it was initially supposed to be a study on the different permutations of Lady Macbeth. And I do not recall exactly how it ended up becoming this, but it did. And I was very happy with it. So basically, I set out to draw, to kind of connect the disconnect between literary analysis and criticism of Shakespeare's work, Macbeth specifically, as a piece of literature, and the way that theater artists look at a piece. The way a literary scholar analyzes a text and the way a theater artist analyzes a text are very different. But essentially, it ends up boiling down to the same thing, and that's kind of what my paper demonstrates. So I did a lot of research in the beginning, trying to figure out what exactly I wanted my concept to be. I'm approaching this from the point of a director. And of course, there's an abundance of literature on Macbeth, most of it dealing with the theme of ambition. There's a lot of stuff even on loss and how that affects what the character's motivations are, how that can affect the show. But I was not happy with what I was finding. I was actually in the costume shop where Helen works as a graduate assistant. And I was talking to her about how unhappy I was with what I was finding. Nothing was clicking with me. And she told me about her thesis and asked if I would like to read her chapter. And this was before it was published. And so she sent it to me, and I knew immediately that this is what I wanted. So, as Dr. DiBiase has said, her thesis posits that there was a botched Caesarean section, and that Lady Macbeth went through this in the 16th century and lost the child. There's a lot of research on how this would happen. Caesarean sections were usually latch-ditch efforts in the 16th century, and the mothers usually always died. And if they survived, they experienced extreme psychological trauma because, of course, there was no anesthetic. A lot of times it meant that the baby was in danger, and so they probably, the child didn't survive either. So this is based on the assumption that Lady Macbeth experienced this horrible, horrible Caesarean section where she would have been cut open with a knife about this long. She has seen the blood, she held her dead child, and then had to also face Macbeth, who would have been kept outside of the room the entire time during the entire birthing process. So it's based on her grief, her loss, her psychosis, and also Macbeth's powerlessness that he feels by not being able to save his wife from this trauma or his child from an untimely death. So a directorial concept is basically an idea or ideas about how a particular production of a show is put on. So there's always a unifying theme, just like you see in literary papers for any novel, book, play, piece of literature. There's always a unifying theme when it comes to design, implementation, all permutations of what you see on stage are based on the directorial concept. That's the easiest way to kind of explain it. You usually start with common themes and then extrapolate that out to the whole show. So what I have done is essentially taken this, this idea, this theme, and applied it to the show, and I've given some design ideas about how that might affect it. Now normally this is a team of people, a team of designers, a team of builders, production, a whole production crew. It's not just one person. So this is a extrapolation of that. So my concept was essentially that Lady Macbeth and Macbeth have recently lost a child, and their desperate thirst for power and their delusions of the supernatural are the result of the grief, trauma, and helplessness that comes from losing a child through a primitive, gruesome cesarean section. So I just said that. So the first thing that I ordered for the purposes of this is not the first thing you think about when you're a director and you're looking at a show. As far as casting goes, to handle such a sensitive subject, I would need really intimate, sensitive actors, especially for Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. There's a lot of psychology surrounding how people handle the loss of a child. There's a lot of importance as to touch, but just as important as the moments when the characters touch or the moments when they don't touch. And there's a lot of arguments that go on between the two of them, of course, during the course of the show. Duncan, I would definitely want kind of a friendly, oblivious-looking person, and I'll explain this a little bit more later. And then just kind of larger built military men, but physicality is not that important. It's easy to fake on stage. As far as costumes go, I would want time period appropriate, and by time period I mean 16th century, not the time period in which Macbeth actually lived, since this is based on what Shakespeare may have known about a cesarean section and not what the actual accuracy would have been. Royalty would be slightly brighter colors, and all others in medium tones. Lady Macbeth and Macbeth would change their costumes in the middle of the show. So the first half of the show, they would be in dark blacks, like the ones I have here, with red trim on them, to kind of hint at the blood. It would kind of be designed after mourning attire, to kind of let people know that something has happened. I found this dress, and I kind of fell in love with it, particularly because of the red drapery and the way it kind of falls, which kind of suggests menstrual blood or just an outpouring of blood from the abdominal area. Set design, I'm a fan of minimalistic set design. If the actors don't need it, it doesn't need to be there. And I would want to keep it very simple. I talked about this before, but I would like the area surrounding to be kind of a black hole, kind of like an abyss that there is no escape from. So there's no necessarily drops in the back, there's no definite end. It's just periods of light and then periods of darkness. This would be particularly important for the scenes with the witches, where it would be pretty simple with just a cauldron and fog. And then I get into some lighting stuff later, but we would do some fun things with the lighting. And possibly, so there are ways to paint things on a stage that they only show up under a certain light, and we would want to paint some like odd symbols to make it kind of seem surreal. The goal is to make those scenes seem like they're not really happening because they're part of Macbeth's delusion. The countryside would be pretty much a standard painted drop, dark colors. This is kind of my image that I chose for that. Inside the castle would be that abyss look with only furniture and light, and outside the castle would be similar to this with just the foam drop down of the outside of the structure. And then the only request that would be like special as far as furniture goes that's not necessary would be a crib for the Lady Macbeth sleepwalking scene, which is the famous hand washing, wringing her hands scene. Lighting design would be mostly dim natural light, as I mentioned, which scenes could have eerie lights, blues or purples, and then a red special on the dagger scene, which is when Macbeth is holding the dagger out and he gives his famous monologue about the dagger before he kills Duncan, and Lady Macbeth's bloody hands, and also the crib. So, like I said earlier, there are ways to paint things so that they take on color or only show up under certain light, and that's what the red special would be for, so that the crib glows red and the dagger also glows red. Sound design would be pretty much non-existent, organic sounds. There's a big emphasis on knocking on doors, so those would be things that the actors would have to be instructed on how to do. And also, I would like the witches to have a reverb effect. So, when it comes to the acting, there is a specific comment made from Banquo to Duncan about the state of tension in the Macbeth household before he first enters. So it becomes clear that Macbeth is aware of what has happened, or at least something traumatic has happened to the two of them. And Duncan is kind of ignorant of this, he brushes it off, he doesn't catch it, and he kind of flaunts his children in the face of Macbeth in the scene immediately following. The witches would be seen in the community in regular clothing. This would kind of require them to have almost two different characters. The character of the handmaidens or the midwives that help deliver the baby, which are just normal citizens, and these demonized versions of them, which are the witches, that Macbeth has created in his mind. Talk about touch. And then I would also remove the Middleton edition scene, which contains a Greek goddess, which kind of makes it odd. Some of those scenes were actually added after after Shakespeare's death, and they're not part of the original text. And so in order to kind of make that work with this concept, I would remove that. And the England scene. So the England scene has been debated kind of by scholars as to whether or not it's important to the motivation of the story, whether or not it should be included as part of the plot. When I looked at this scene, I had to turn off literary Jessika and turn on theater artist Jessika. And I really think that the key to pulling off the scene is really simple, and it's just sincerity. Malcolm and Macbeth have to both be really sincere about what they're saying. In this scene, if you're not familiar with it, Malcolm and Macduff are basically getting into an argument. Macduff's family has just been slaughtered, and he is hopelessly depressed and feeling like there's no hope for England or him or anyone else. And Malcolm is kind of down on himself, saying that he's really a terrible person. He doesn't know if he can lead, if he can do it. And then throughout the scene, by the end of the scene, he ends up saying that he is a good person, he can do this. But it's only after seeing Macduff kind of give up that he takes this on himself. And that's something that's very human that we all do. We all get down on ourselves. We can all look at ourselves and say, oh, I'm useless, I'm horrible, I'm mean, I'm rude. And then when the time arises, when the time comes, we rise to the occasion. So, that is the end of my presentation.